We are all set to go. So hello and welcome everybody to this second webinar and our final event of Earth Month 2023. We will be following this up with two podcast episodes, one featuring Lorraine Johnson and another featuring Heather Holm, both of whom have done absolutely tremendous work in the field of pollinators and native plants. It was a real pleasure to speak with both of them. The recordings sound great, and they will be up over the next few weeks on Green Teachers Podcast, Talking with Green Teachers, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. I almost feel a bit pretentious saying that phrase, but literally it is true. Anywhere you get your podcasts, you can just search Talking with Green Teachers. We've had people tune in from just under 100 countries, so almost half the nations on Earth have had listeners to Talking with Green Teachers. All 6 continents, Antarctica accepted. Suppose penguins and leopard seals aren't prioritizing this yet. They do live in a rather harsh climate, so understandable. But here we will get started. I will share my screen. Yeah, so tips for teaching about bees and other native pollinators. Of course, this is something that we could spend a huge amount of time digging into, yet we only have 45 to 60 minutes to dig into. So I'm being selective in what we touch on, and this will be really focused on some of the main questions that a lot of educators have based on discussions that we have had with educators who have found it difficult or challenging for various reasons to teach about bees and other native pollinators. Here you see a picture of one of my favorite pollinators, the tricolored bumblebee, also known as Bombus ternaris, on some Canada goldenrod. And that was a very cold morning up at Algonquin Park in South Central Ontario, Canada, where I used to work as a parks interpreter, a job that I still think about very fondly to this day, even though it's now been 10 years since I worked up there. Just to let you know a bit about Green Teacher, I mentioned earlier, we're located in southeastern Ontario, a little bit east of Toronto. Our office specifically is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. This is covered by the Williams Treaty, and you can find out about the traditional peoples of the lands you're on at nativeland.ca. For those who attended webinar number 1 2 weeks ago, that was with Lorraine Johnson and hosted by my colleague Sophia, we are giving away a prize. We gave away one prize for that webinar, and we are giving away a prize for this webinar. So stay right to the end. We will have a little quiz question. I actually have 2, always good to have a backup. And the first person to answer the quiz question correctly will win one of these guides to pollinators from Canada's nonprofit Outdoor Learning Store. And they are really wonderful guides put out by Waterford Press. For anyone who's not familiar, they put out these pocket-sized foldable laminated guides that are very durable, lightweight, and just great little companions to have out in the field. And they basically touch on everything, pollinators included. So stay tuned to the end and pay attention to any little statistics and factoids that are thrown out there, because they might be involved in the quiz question. So a bit more about Green Teacher. We are a registered charity in Canada, yet we serve a global network, and we're dedicated to helping educators both inside and outside schools enhance environmental literacy among young learners. So we cover a lot of territory within this broad field of environmental and outdoor education. As I say, this Earth Month, we are focusing on pollinators and native plants. Oh, my slide doesn't want to advance. This usually happens once per PowerPoint presentation. All right, there we go. A bit more about Green Teachers. So we have a nonprofit magazine for youth educators. Our 2 most recent issues were Learning Through a Forest Lens, which came out in March, and Teaching About the Energy Transition, which came out shortly before that. Special themed issues, which are available to all subscribers. We've published numerous books over the last few years. Probably the one most relevant to teaching about pollinators is our Teaching About Invasive Species book. So I recommend you check those out either on the Green Teacher website or the Outdoor Learning Store website. They also hold all of Green Teacher's books. I mentioned our podcast, Talking with Green Teachers, available wherever you get your podcasts. We have recorded now 59 episodes. They're not all published yet. We still have 3 of the as of yet recorded ones to publish, and plans to do many, 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 many more. We are actually just in the process of securing Mr. Douglas Tallamy to be a guest on the podcast. He is the writer of Nature's Best Hope and Bringing Nature Home, among many other books that aren't specifically about pollinators, but touch quite heavily on pollinators and how we can just green the grounds and regenerate the grounds around our homes, schools, local areas, etc. He's been a wonderful contributor to the field of environmental education, and we'll be really excited to have him up on the podcast. You may well have heard about this webinar from some of our webinar partners, both in Canada and the US, and one international in Ecuador. So this is a listing of our Canadian webinar partners. A lot of these are fellow environmental education organizations, some of them associated with universities, some of them charities, some of them provincial affiliates of the North American Association of Environmental Education. The NAAE that I just mentioned has many state affiliates in the United States, and you may well have heard from one of them about this webinar. So we thank them for spreading the word about our webinars, and we in turn spread the word about initiatives that they are hosting throughout the year. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship, much like pollination. So I mentioned at the outset that I thought we would structure this experience, because we don't have a huge amount of time to dig into a topic where we could go in so many different directions. I thought we would base this around 3 core questions. With a lot of the lessons and educational activities that we put out at Green Teacher, we often focus on overarching inquiry questions, and this is something that you will see in the activities that we run through tonight. Actually, it's not necessarily tonight where you're joining us from if you're on the Pacific Coast. This afternoon, this evening / tonight. Anyways, question number 1, how can we teach about pollinators when we don't know very much about them? So this is a totally legitimate question, and I think can apply to a lot of different topics in natural history in general. How can I teach about plants if there's so many different types of plants and I don't know the names of them all? And even if I know the names, maybe I don't know the natural history and the ecology of them all. Just to give you some context, again, I'm based in Ontario. There's about 3,300 species of plants, so over 3,000 species of vascular plants just in Ontario, about 2/3 of which are native. That's a lot of different species of plants. Compare that to something like birds, very popular. There's about 500 species of birds on the Ontario list, and that includes a lot of the rare sort of one-off ones that only show up once in a blue moon. So biodiversity can be very intimidating, and insect diversity, of course, just is through the roof, supersedes everything else. So yeah, how can we teach about pollinators when we don't know very much about them? That is one of the questions that we will dig into during this session. Question number 2, what if we don't have easy access to pollinator habitat at or near our learning settings? So maybe you live in the temperate zone and most, if not all, of your flowering plants are not flowering for a good part of the year, the school year, whatever your season happens to be. Maybe you have a lot of manicured lawn. Maybe you have mostly concrete. Lots of different challenges unique to each situation. This is a really common question we get, so we will dig into this one. And question number 3, why is it important to make connections between pollinator health and the growth of staple food crops? So much in nature interpretation, or more broadly speaking, in outdoor and environmental education, we are trying to make connections to people's lives so that they can see the relevance, they can see the interdependence, whether it's direct or indirect. And with pollinators, there are many direct connections between staple food crops that humans depend on and that have really served as the foundation of human societies. So why is it important to make these connections? Broadly speaking, the answer maybe seems implicit, but we'll dig into some of the statistics that really show us the metrics behind why making those connections is so important. And we will also look at how to make some of those connections by walking through several different educational activities. So a little bit more context. I mentioned Green Teacher has quarterly digital magazine. So we have 4 issues per year. Typically, we publish on each equinox or solstice. So we follow a phenological schedule, which makes it easy to understand and remember, especially for folks like us who are engaged with outdoor and environmental education. So last summer in 2022, we put out a special, actually a supersized issue about wild native bees. We did this in partnership with a major charitable organization, Friends of the Earth. They have affiliates all over the world. We specifically worked with the Canadian affiliate, and the individual whom we worked the most with was B. Olivastri, and that is not a mispronunciation. Her full name is Beatrice, but she goes by B, which of course is very fitting given that one of the core priorities for Friends of the Earth Canada is the bee cause. Why do we focus on the bee cause? Because bees are important. Terrible nature pun, but I would imagine in this crowd, nature puns are probably acceptable, even if they are kind of wah-wah. So we worked with Friends of the Earth. We produced this special issue of the magazine, and the way that we laid it out was to have 6 articles at the outset that kind of gave you the need-to-know information about wild native bees with a North America focus. Green Teacher does have subscribers all over the world and listeners to the podcast from many different parts of the world, but the vast majority of the folks in our network are in Canada and the US. So we had mostly a North American focus for this issue of the magazine, and those 6 first articles that just kind of, as I say, lay out the need to know information about wild native bees. Right. So to do a brief summary of some of those articles, let's just look at a few key metrics about wild native bees. There's a lot, but these are some of the really big ones. So 20,000 bee species worldwide. And of course, as with anything to do with invertebrates, that is probably a gross underestimate, and it's probably already obsolete, and it's probably going to be obsolete 5 minutes from now, and then another 5 minutes. And so it goes with insects and other invertebrates. There are just so many of them, and there's so much we still do not know about them. Wasps alone, we're discovering more and more of them all the time, and some of them are so tiny but so spectacular that they shock us when we see them under a hand lens. So yeah, take this number with a grain of salt. It is probably going to get a lot bigger, but still, that is a significant number. Far, far exceeds so many other taxa. I mean, just for context, birds is between 9 and 10,000. So we're looking at double the number of bird species in the world are just the number of bee species, and that doesn't even include other pollinators like wasps, flies, butterflies, moths, and then getting into the vertebrates, bats, and even some birds as well, depending on where in the world you are. So we're talking about a lot of bees. They are key to the yield of approximately 85% of food crops. That is maybe the most staggering statistic to come out of all of these articles, which were mostly worked on by our partners at Friends of the Earth. So 85% of food crops. I mean, that is just an unbelievable figure that really very quickly makes that reason for learning about the connections between bees and food crops just so prevalent. So that's a really huge statistic. In terms of bee species in North America specifically, we have about 4,000 bee species. For those who are based in Canada, a little over 800. Again, all of these numbers probably will get bigger as we discover more. Now, that figure of 4,000 bee species in North America, that was pre-1622, which was the year of the introduction of the honeybee. A lot of, and this is something that you've probably noticed in your experience, a lot of educational programming and interpretation about bees and pollination often does focus on honeybees. And of course, there are lots of good reasons for that. They're remarkable social creatures. They're ubiquitous. They're abundant in many parts of the world. And of course, they produce honey, and honey is great. And that's amazing. So in no ways do I want this to come across as though we're anti-honeybee, despite the fact that at least in North America, they are non-native introduced species that can have many harmful impacts on the plus or minus 4,000 native species of bees. What I would suggest is if you are going to teach about honeybees, which of course has wonderful value, do that alongside also teaching about some of the wild native bee species. And in some ways that's easier because there's only one honeybee, but there's lots of different native bee species, as we can see in these numbers here. Maybe the most familiar group of native bees in North America are the bumblebees. And I think to the surprise of some, there are more of them than we think. So about 46 in North America, just where I am in Southern Ontario, sort of in my, say, a 2-hour drive away from where I am in that general region, there's about 15 different bumblebee species. And the great thing is they're fairly readily identifiable just by getting a photograph of them. You could capture them with a net, put them in a jar, take a look at them, but you don't really even need to. I mean, bees usually just go to a flower and they stay there for a little while, at least long enough for you to get a picture of them. And it's just the coloring of the hairs or the pile on the back of bumblebees. Those colors and patterns are quite distinct across the different bumblebee species. So you can get some pretty accurate species identification of bumblebees. There's a really great website about bumblebee identification that I will point you to in a little bit. Some of you may have already seen it. And then there's also this book, and we'll include all the, oh, this book's actually showing up. Oh, was not quite. All right. Bumblebees of North America. We'll put all of this in the follow-up email that we will send out. But yes, Bumblebees of North America, fairly on the nose, but easy to remember title. And it is an identification guide to all 46 species of bumblebees in North America with really great and usable color photo plates that you can use for identifying bumblebees, which is a great entry point for a lot of students because bumblebees are ubiquitous. They're all around us. And like honeybees, they're also social. So they have a really interesting life history. And we do tend to see them. I saw my first few queen bumblebees a few days ago, actually, first of the year, which is always just one of the great signs of spring here in the temperate north. We try to keep things as positive as possible, but sometimes to be honest and tell the whole story, we do have to get into some statistics that are a little less encouraging. So there was this landmark report published in 2017, so about 6 years ago now. And it was based on 27 years of study at 63 nature reserves in Germany. And they documented a 76% decline in insect biomass. So the total just amount of all of the insects over a 27-year period, so effectively one generation in these 60-plus German nature reserves, 76% decline. Subsequent to the publication of that study in 2017, and if you just Google 2017 insect Krefeld Entomological Society, Germany, you'll see the report pop up right away. It had many, many different contributors. And that sort of spawned this term insect apocalypse, which has been written about a bit more in recent times by folks like Dave Goulson, who's written a lot about bees and pollinators in his work. He's based in the UK. Similar studies have been done in other areas, such as Costa Rica, and the results have been painting a similar picture, not necessarily exactly that 76% figure, because it does differ depending on where you are in the world and the different factors related to pesticides and so on and so forth. But significant declines in insect biomass, significant declines in species richness and biodiversity, painting a very alarming picture. Even just anecdotally, a lot of people noticing that the number of insects splattering on their windshields is less, which from one perspective is maybe a nice thing. It's fewer insects getting killed by your vehicle, fewer insects to clean off of your vehicle, but it's also indicative of these larger trends. A book that I highly recommend to really dig into the ins and outs of the insect apocalypse is Silent Earth. And again, we'll put this in the follow-up email. But Silent Earth by Dave Goulson. It came out in 2021. And it talks about the statistics of insect declines, the various reasons for insect declines. So light pollution, pesticide use, climate change, introduction of invasive species. Those are sort of the main ones. It also offers potential solutions. And this is something I always appreciate about books that speak of environmental difficulties, is it doesn't just tell everything that's going wrong. It says these are some potential avenues for fixing it. George Monbiot, also based in the UK, a journalist, just wrote a book, Regenesis, that talks about more sustainable farming practices where the soil has a more front and center role, and that can have significant positive impacts on land use and reduce the amount of land that we're using, which can be very beneficial for pollinators, because habitat loss for agriculture has also been a major driver of declines in pollinating plants and pollinating insects. So those are a few key statistics that come out of those first 6 articles at the beginning of this issue of the magazine. Following that, those 6 articles, we also have an educational activity called A Menu Brought to You by Wild Native Bees. And that one was written by yours truly, but based on a tremendous amount of research. This is an activity that's generally geared towards middle school-ish students, but it's quite scalable for students who are younger or older. We'll go through this activity in a bit more detail a little bit later in the session here today, but just sort of in the bottom right where you can see that pink highlight square, that's a link to 5 other educational activities that are linked to from this issue of the magazine. And it will take you to this page where you can see those 6 activities, again, all of which are accessible to subscribers to Green Teacher Magazine. So the first 2, squash bee pollination simulation and storytelling with wild native bees, those are mostly geared towards younger learners, so sort of early elementary school. But again, they can be scaled and adapted depending on your particular setting. The 2 in the middle are kind of the middle school ones. So A Menu Brought to You by Wild Native Bees, the one I just mentioned, and then local bee diversity, because so foundational to environmental education is place-based education and keeping it local and getting to know who and what is right in your backyard, quite literally. And then the last 2 on the right-hand side there, bumblebee pollination observations and the rusty patch bumblebee conservation status simulation. Those are for older learners, more sort of high school, post-secondary. Again, these can all be scaled, but we wanted to offer educational activities that would appeal to folks across a broad age range. So we're going to walk through 3 of these activities, and each one is going to be linked to one of those 3 main questions that we are going to base our exploration on during the session together today. Again, stay to the end and we will have a little quiz question. And whoever answers the question correctly first will win one of the pollinator guides from the Outdoor Learning Store. So stay tuned to the end and we will have the quiz question. So I will end my slideshow and we will jump into the first activity. So this activity moves downstream from that first question. How can we teach about pollinators when we don't know much about them? Very fair question. When we have 800 some odd bee species in Canada, 4,000 bee species in North America, and then you throw the flies and the wasps and butterflies and moths and bats and some birds, and my goodness, that's a lot of pollinators. How can I possibly learn all of these different species? There are various entry points. Certainly online resources like iNaturalist have been fantastic. Oh, and just to answer Annie's question there before we continue here, the yield of 85% food crops, is this native bees and is this Canada or worldwide? So it's all bee species worldwide, to answer the question. So because it's worldwide, it includes species that are native in some areas and non-native in other areas. So yeah, that is a global figure. So thank you, Annie, for that question. So yeah, what if I don't know all of the pollinators? Well, we had a podcast interview last summer with Larry Weber, who is also based in Minnesota, where Heather Holm is based. And he has written numerous field guides about natural history with a particular focus on pollinators, and also spiders is one of his specialties. So we spoke with him last summer about phenological teaching, so essentially teaching through the seasons. And because he's in Minnesota and lives in the temperate zone, it's just a constant state of change. And one of the big bits of advice that he shared in that podcast interview, which is titled Phenology-Based Teaching, so you can find it on the Green Teacher podcast, he talked about learning alongside your students. No one expects you to learn all of the insect species just on your schoolyard or your nature center yard or your conservation area park, wherever you might be based. That would be unrealistic. But learning alongside your students can be really enriching. And if you have a series of guiding questions and inquiry-based questions in particular, that can really frame the exploration, and it can be really fun to learn alongside your students. Resources like iNaturalist can be great just to get a snapshot of which insect species and which flowering plants are in your area. You don't even need to have an iNaturalist account to benefit from a lot of what is on there. You can do sortable searches that are based on season, that are based on a certain number of years, that are based on a particular location, based on a particular taxon of life forms. So you could do, so for example, I'm in Northumberland County, Southern Ontario. I could do a search on iNaturalist of just April 2023 insects, Northumberland County, Ontario, Canada. And then it would rank all of the sightings from the most recent. So like any from today in my particular county, right back to ones earlier this month. So that sortable search feature is really, really great. And it's the kind of thing that you might start a learning session with your students to say, all right, this is what's in bloom right now. These are some pollinators that people are seeing and documenting right now. Let's use this as a starting point. Let's see if we can find any of these. We'll probably also find some that aren't on iNaturalist, and maybe as a class we can add them to iNaturalist. And for those who have used iNaturalist, you'll be familiar with the artificial intelligence identification tool. I know the whole discussion about AI is beyond the scope of what we can touch on this evening. And of course, there are many pros and cons to it. But long story short, there is artificial intelligence identification of photographs of species on iNaturalist. Sometimes it's unbelievably accurate. Sometimes you're just like, what the heck is it talking about? But again, it can be a good starting point. And the other useful tool for those who are not familiar with iNaturalist is you can recommend that a researcher identifies your photo for you. And I know some folks personally who spend their evenings, particularly in the cold winter, going through other people's iNaturalist lists and identifying the unidentified species. I've heard that that can be quite the rabbit hole and can take a lot of time, and all of a sudden it's 4 a.m. in the morning and you're like, my goodness, I can't look at fireflies anymore. But that's a tool that is available and something that you could maybe have as an ongoing tool with your class. I'm a big advocate of using storytelling as an entry point to learning about really any sort of life forms in your area. And I thought we would start with a little storytelling activity here. So before I share the screen again and we look at this first activity in a bit more detail, I have a little challenge for you. I'm going to read aloud a very short story, and I want you to listen for all of the different foods or food-related products that are mentioned in this short story. It'll only be 2.5 minutes, so it's very, very short. So listen for as many foods as you can, try to write them down, and try to come up with a number of different foods. Now, very important instruction. This is a cool little Zoom feature. If you think by the end of the story, if you think you know the number of foods that I mentioned, don't write it in the chat box just yet. We're going to do it all together. So I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, go, and then everyone's going to press enter in the chat box. And this, as I say, it's a neat little tool. Everyone's answers will just pop up immediately. So we'll see all of them pop up at once and get a sense of sort of how close the group is collectively. So if you think you have a number of foods mentioned in the story, hold off until I do 3, 2, 1. Then we'll just all throw it into the chat box at once and it'll just, boom, it'll explode there. So have a pen or pencil or typing tools ready, and I will start reading the story aloud. This is from the activity Storytelling with Wild Native Bees. Generally, this one is geared a bit more toward younger learners, but it's the kind of thing that can be adapted. Maybe you change some of the language in the story, but you'll get the general gist of it. So I'm going to start reading. Again, you're documenting all of the different foods with a focus on the number of foods. And I should mention this includes sauces and condiments as well. So ready, set, go. I shall begin. So Lily's Big Blue Bag is the name of the story. So Lily wakes up early on this Saturday morning, full of excitement. Why is she so excited? It's picnic day with her third grade class. Lily is also a bit nervous, though, because she hasn't prepared her meal yet. Last week, when Miss Jimenez announced the plans for the picnic, everyone volunteered to bring different foods. One student would bring fresh apples, another peaches, another nectarines. A small group said they would take care of berries, specifically blackberries and raspberries. Someone even offered to bring sunflower seeds. Lily had wanted to bring fresh plums from the tree in her backyard, but there is just one problem. All the plums have fallen to the ground and are being eaten by wasps. Lily needs a new plan, and she needs it quick. She rushes down to the kitchen to see what she can find. Opening the cupboard, Lily sees some cans of beans and a bag of almonds. No, those won't do. She opens the refrigerator. There's a jar of cranberry sauce, a can of pumpkin paste, 2 types of jams, blueberry and apricot, and some mustard. Those won't do either. Maybe there's something in the crisper. Lily looks inside and finds 1 tomato and half a cucumber. Not enough to feed even one person. Uh-oh. Feeling panicked, Lily closes the refrigerator and circles around for some more ideas. The countertop is empty except for a few cups and plates. What is she going to tell Miss Jimenez? Then, Lily remembers something from last night. Her mother had asked her to put away the food in the big blue bag by the front door. Is the big blue bag still there? With a mix of nervousness and anticipation, Lily bolts to the front door to find the big blue bag nestled against her boots. But what's inside? Still nervous, Lily slowly opens the bag. She breathes a deep sigh of relief upon seeing what's there. 1 big squash and an enormous watermelon. Phew! To be continued. So that is the story Lily's Big Blue Bag, which is a great starting point for an exploration of the local pollinators in your area, because the stories engage the emotions. This particular activity engages that sort of intrinsic hunter-gatherer instinct. So I'm going to do 3, 2, 1 in just a moment here. So if you think you know the number of foods or food-related products mentioned in that story, be at the ready. I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, go. And when I say go, you can press enter on the chat box and all of the answers will appear. So 3, 2, 1, go. Boom, there we go. And oh, very nice. So everybody is pretty well in the ballpark. And depending on the averages metric that we want to use, mean, median, or mode, if we just go by mode, the most frequently listed number is 18, and that is the correct answer. Give yourselves a round of applause. 18 different foods or food products mentioned in this story, and I'll just share my screen again and we'll bring up and see the specific list of foods for you to cross-reference. So there is the story. And the list of foods is, so we have apples, peaches, nectarines, blackberries, raspberries, sunflower seeds, plums. We also have almonds, cranberry, pumpkin, blueberry, apricot, mustard, tomato, cucumber, And then finally, at the very end, we have squash and watermelon. So you might notice that these are all plants, and they're all plants that have flowers. And because they have flowers, they are either pollinated by the wind or they're pollinated by pollinators, specifically insects. And in fact, all of these are pollinated by insects. So this activity you can pair up with one of the articles from our issue of the magazine. So we'll just jump to this page here. There's a nice chart on this page, and you might not be able to see it in specific detail, but basically it lists a whole bunch of popular foods and crops, many of which were just mentioned in that story. And it shows which groups of bees can pollinate them. Now, we don't get right down to the species level except for honeybees, where we do mention honeybees collecting pollen or nectar, but we also touch on bumblebees, and then the 90% of bees, the solitary bees, the non-social ones. And then there are some additional notes. So again, this idea of drawing those links between staple food crops and pollinators, this is a great activity for doing that as well, in addition to getting to know the pollinators in your area and their importance to those staple food crops, some of which might also be grown in your area. And you can probably imagine there's a lot of potential for this to expand in many different directions of inquiry as you're doing this sort of exercise with your learners. Is, okay, let's now do some research into all of the different crops that are grown in this area. Which ones are on this list? Okay, based on this list, let's look at the genera or genuses of bees that pollinate or collect nectar from these crops. Can we find any representatives of those right around our learning site or a nature center or conservation area? Can we find images of them up on iNaturalist? Can we cross-reference with iNaturalist? There's so many great opportunities for taking the inquiry further, which is really what it's all about. So just going back to the storytelling activity, we've given a listing here of the different genera of bees that are mentioned on the charts that I just showed you, both their Latin names and their English names, just because I know Latin names might be a little bit tough to sort of wrap your head around, particularly if you're working with younger learners. It's a little easier to talk about mason bees and leafcutter bees or bumblebees than it is to talk about Peponapsis or Svastra or Xylocopa, although maybe there's opportunity there too. So the core activity with this, after you've read the story and you've done the activity and challenged your class to listen for the number of foods and how many could they document, you're going to list all of the 18 foods. Then you can have your students draw a picture of their favorite food from the list. So again, sort of differentiating the instruction to get people engaging with the content in many different ways. Maybe they're a visual learner, maybe they're an auditory learner. We try to approach this from many different entry points. Then, referencing the chart, reveal to each student which bee genera may have helped pollinate their favorite food from the story. So if their favorite food from the story is almonds, you can look at, okay, which species from the chart pollinate almonds, or which genera from the chart. Okay, these are the genera that pollinate almonds. And then each student then adds to the drawing the following sentence. So my food, so for example, almond, was likely pollinated by, and then they can list the English names of the genera of bees that may have pollinated the picture that they have drawn of their favorite food from the story. And then getting back to iNaturalist, so digital resource like iNaturalist, show the class example pictures of each genus, and you'll have no trouble doing that. Every genus of just about every living thing on the planet is documented on iNaturalist. It's really amazing. It's basically the field guide to life on Earth. And then as a follow-up activity on the same piece of paper with the drawings, students can write their own version of the rest of the story. So we ended the story with that familiar to be continued. To help students, you might give them some prompting questions. Again, with Green Teacher, we often use prompting questions and inquiry questions to guide activities. So questions like, Does Lily choose the squash or the watermelon from the big blue bag? Maybe both. How does Lily prepare her food? Does she cook it? Does she slice it? If it's squash, does she turn it into a soup? What happens on Lily's way to school? Maybe she goes by a pollinator garden and sees some bumblebees and thinks, wow, maybe they contributed to the food that's going to be at our little potluck. Who else is at the picnic? What is the weather like during the picnic? Do Lily's teacher and classmates like the food she has brought? These are all just prompts that learners can use as they fill out the rest of the story. This can be done written, this can be oral, they can video record it, they can audio record it. Again, there's so many different ways to differentiate this. As an optional extension, students could write a prequel to the story, specifically where the bees pollinate the flowers of the different foods mentioned. You could also host your own class picnic featuring the foods from the story. And you can make a point of mentioning all of the bee genera that helped make the meal possible through their pollination. Maybe you'll print out photos of representatives of the different genera, or have your students do drawings of them, and those can be posted around or shared during the picnic. And if you invite parents, it can be shared with the picnic, and you can do a toast to the bee genera that have contributed to your meal. So lots and lots of really neat opportunities with this kind of activity. So I'll just check in the chat box just to see if we have any questions that have come in. Oh yes, just some friendly trash talking, to use a sports term. We're very friendly trash talking with some friendly competition happening there. All right, so question number 2 was, what if we don't have easy access to pollinator habitat at or near our learning setting? So again, totally legitimate question. Maybe you're in an inner city environment and it's mostly concrete around you and you don't have any garden space. So one big recommendation are container pollinator gardens, and you can see these at all levels. You can see them on high-rise apartments. There's no reason why, just because you're 20 stories up, that you can't have native plants. You can have pollinator gardens up in the sky, and the pollinators will find you. It's amazing how many insects drift up high into the sky and can actually get up to those high heights. Wasps maybe have a bit of a more difficult time because they don't tend to be able to fly quite as far, but bees certainly will find you. So being in a high rise is not necessarily a limiting factor. If you're on the ground, but it's mostly concrete around, plant some containers that all have native plants in them. If you can create a pollinator garden or multiple pollinator gardens on site at your learning setting, all the better. And if you're at a more natural setting like a park and you have access to something like a meadow or a forest edge or a clearing in a forest where there are lots of flowering plants, or maybe it's in a forest, but it's early season before leaf out in the temperate zone, as is the case right now, all of the maples and oaks are in flower and will be dropping the flowers soon before the leaves come out. So lots of opportunities depending on what your context is. One of the big ones, especially in K-12 classrooms, is what if it's just a manicured lawn on our site, which unfortunately is often the case at a lot of K-12 schools. Well, fear not. We are going to look into the bumblebee pollinator observation, because bumblebees, with their varied length tongues, happen to be generalist foragers and can visit a lot of different pollinating plants. Some pollinators are very picky. We see this a lot, particularly with butterflies, where they maybe only pollinate just one specific family or one specific genus, and in a small number of cases, just one specific species of food. We certainly see this with the larval food plants for a lot of butterfly species. Bumblebees, however, are generalists. And even if you have a semi-manicured lawn, it's pretty amazing the biodiversity of plants that can still persist on a lawn. And sort of a little side dream I have is to publish a field guide. I don't know if field guides in paper form will still exist for much longer since everything's going digital, but I think it would be neat to publish a field guide to the botany of lawns. And maybe such a thing already exists and the idea has already been taken. But my point generally is that it's not just fescue or reed canary grass that's growing on a lot of lawns. You can have like 40 different species of plants growing on a lawn that seems like it's fairly well manicured. Some of them are even native species. A good number of them are non-native. So you've got your white clover, your red clover. And I've spent a lot of time observing bumblebees, just visiting white clover and red clover on manicured lawns, on soccer fields, baseball fields, and that sort of thing. Thank you for the feedback on the lawn field guide idea, and feel free to steal it. I mean, the whole idea is to spread the good word. So in this activity, which is more sort of geared towards sort of preteen, kind of middle school, or sorry, this one's more kind of middle school, high school, even post-secondary. So it's a little more advanced. The overarching inquiry question is, what makes a particular site attractive to bumblebees? So it's sort of examining the suitability, the differences between different plots of land. It's a great opportunity for nature journaling. You don't really just nature sheets. We provide, and also create your own. Those one, but they're just the greatest. And power hand lens. It weighs nothing. It fits, like I could 10 of them in my hand, and it's just the best. It's just absolutely the best. Great little tool. 10 times is perfect for identifying a lot of different insect species. So some preliminary work. Check out this website, bumblebeewatch.org. It is North America specific, but you can submit your sightings, and it's a great resource for identifying the bumblebee species because you can select a species from the drop-down. For example, this is one of my favorites in my local area, the northern amber bumblebee. It's got an almost all yellow thorax and abdomen, except for the one black cross stripe on the abdomen. So it very much presents as like a almost fully yellow bumblebee. And it's one that I see with some regularity in my area. So it talks about floral associations, other lookalike species, its range map, its flight season. This is just an awesome website, totally free. So check out that website as a starting point. Whoops, I lost my page here. There we go. So check out that website. Check out the bumblebee species. Find the ones that are in your particular area based on the range map. So that could just be a neat little, 15, 20-minute activity with your learners. All right, everyone go on the website and let's create a list of species of bumblebees that we might find in this area. Read through a document that we created, Bumblebee FAQs, so frequently asked questions. That's just in the appendix below. We don't have a lot of time to go through that. It just gives you sort of a baseline of knowledge about bumblebee ecology, so sort of how the bumblebee life cycle goes throughout the year, from the queens to the workers and so on and so forth. Now, the core activity is to conduct a field study of a site where numerous flowering plants are in bloom. Ideally, this would be on the grounds of your education facility, but if not, try somewhere else. Each student or group of students, doesn't really matter, completes a worksheet. Here is the worksheet. Oh, sorry, I have the worksheet right here. Oh, sorry, worksheet's not popping up. We'll include that in the follow-up email as well. Not to worry. Basically, it's just to mark down the basic features that they observe about their plot of land where they're doing the observation. So how big is it? What plants they observe, what bumblebee species they observe visiting, what their behavior is like, how long they spend on each flower, how many flowers they visit, how long that takes, what's the weather like, just all of those basic statistics. If multiple bumblebee species are present, you might just have each group focus on one species because it can be a lot to focus on more than one. And then as a follow-up, based on the descriptions of the bumblebees observed during the site, determine which species were observed. And again, you can cross-reference with that bumblebee website or a book like the one I mentioned earlier. You can get each student or group to share the results with the class. Based on the observations, you can then discuss these questions. So question one, what about this site makes it attractive to bumblebees? They have to give specific evidence. What about this site is potentially unattractive to bumblebees? Again, giving specific evidence. How could the site be made more attractive to bumblebees? So you can almost imagine that if this is a plot of manicured grass on your learning site, maybe this is the incentive to build a pollinator garden. And maybe it all starts with this activity. And then the final question, what specific steps could be taken to make this site more attractive to bumblebees? what would the time and financial costs be? So maybe this is the jumping off point for your first school garden. And we certainly have a lot of resources about school gardens. We don't have time to go through some of the optional activities, but there are lots of different potential opportunities related to building a pollinator garden that can spring up from this activity. Just in the interest of time, we'll jump to that third and final question. So final question is, why is it important to make connections between pollinator health and the growth of staple food crops? Again, just in the interest of time, because it is almost the top of the hour, I won't spend a huge amount of time on that question because we touched on it a little bit when we talked about the first activity with the storytelling. But there's another activity that we talked about a little bit earlier, a menu brought to you by Wild Native Bees. This one was written by, again, yours truly. And the overarching inquiry question for this is, which species or genera of bees contribute to a healthy diet? And the core activity is to split the class into groups of 3 or 4 students. Each group will be responsible for creating a one-day menu. Each meal or snack must include at least 1, ideally 2 or more, of the following foods. So you can see the list there. This list bears a striking resemblance to the list of foods from the story in the first activity. All of these foods are listed on the chart that we looked at as part of the first activity. With this list of food, you encourage your students to put together their meal and their menu, and here's an example menu. So for breakfast, they might have oatmeal with blueberries, along with apple juice, a peach, and some sliced strawberries. Sounds like a good, nutritious, balanced, healthy breakfast. As a morning snack, maybe some almonds. For lunch, a sandwich with lettuce, cucumbers, and a sauce of your choice, maybe mustard. Throw in a plum and mixed squash. As an afternoon snack, watermelon slices. For dinner, a bean salad, including broccoli and cauliflower, with rice, and then raspberry pie, one of my favorites. And then an optional snack throughout the day, sunflower seeds. So this isn't really going too far out into left field, this kind of menu for a single day. It's certainly plant-focused, but if you've read folks like Michael Pollan, one of his 3 rules of food, one of them was eat food. Another rule was mostly plants, and the other was not too much. So yes, plant-focused diet, certainly beneficial. And these are fairly easily accessible foods for many different people. And then once you've had your class put together their menus based on the list of foods, each group then consults the agricultural crops chart that we looked at earlier. So it shows all the different foods, the agricultural crops, the bee genera that visit either for collecting pollen or collecting nectar, and any notes related to that. And you can, based on that, determine which documented bee genera can be found in your region. You note these genera. The groups then share their menus with each other, as well as their documented bee genera. And then you can come together as a class or a group and put together a group log of the total local bee genera among all of the groups. So not only are you building a profile of which genera pollinate the plants that are part of this activity and part of your class's menus, but you're also building that biodiversity profile of the bee genera in your area. For some additional research, each group researches the native forage plants of their documented bee genera. So that is also included in one of the charts in the magazine. Haven't looked at that one just yet, but we will include that one in the follow-up email, and it shows for each genera which flowering plant genera they're most likely to visit. So, with something like monarch butterflies visiting milkweed, that kind of thing. So you document the native plants that are in your region. And then as a culminating event, you have a class potluck where each meal includes foods whose flowers have been pollinated by local bee genera. Identify the bees and forage plants that you can thank for the meal. And as optional extensions, you can research threats to the various bee species documented in this activity and devise an action plan for supporting these species. Maybe it's habitat protection, maybe it's reducing light pollution, maybe it's contributing to climate change mitigation, all of which can be beneficial. Maybe it's petitioning local leaders to not use pesticides. I know there are local pesticide bans in certain areas, but not in other areas. You could find photographs of the documented bee genera and forage plants, print them out, and post them throughout your learning space so that you can have a visual representation of that biodiversity profile. Or you could visit a local green space where some of the documented forage plants can be found and search for their pollinators. And if you live in the temperate zone in northeastern North America in late August and early September, go to a squash field and look for hoary squash bees. We have a full article on that and a full educational activity about hoary squash bees. They're very pretty. They visit those beautiful flowers on squash plants at the proper time of the year. And it is really neat to see a species that is so specific to the plants that it visits for collecting floral resources. But that's not the only example. There are many others, and it is really neat to learn about it and then go and see it, or vice versa. Both ways are really, really effective. So I've gone 5 minutes over time. So before we wrap up, I'm going to quickly do the quiz question. Then I will open it up for Q&A if anyone wants to stick around and ask questions. I will include in the follow-up email that will go out in the next few days the various resources that I mentioned, some links to some of the activities, and I will also include the link to the recording of this webinar if you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with someone else who might benefit from this and might find it interesting. Of course, this is just scratching the surface, but that is the nature of it when we're talking about plants and insects, especially. There's just so darn many of them, but that I file under the category of nice problems to have. So quiz question. So this will be whoever answers the answer, or whoever gives the correct answer first will receive their prize from the Outdoor Learning Store, the laminated, foldable, lightweight pollinator guides from Waterford Press. So I have two questions just in case we need a backup, but my initially planned question is, are you ready? How many bumblebee species are in North America? 46 is correct, and Vanessa, as you can see, was the first to answer correctly. So Vanessa, please send me an email. I will just throw my email address in the chat box, ian@greenteacher.com, just with your contact information, including your mailing address, and we will get your guide sent to you right away. So I see the other figures there. So 4,000, that is the number of bee species in North America, at least the number in 1622 before the introduction of the honeybee. And then 20,000 is the current estimate for the number of bee species worldwide, but that's probably an underestimate. I mean, there's some people that say there are about 1 million insect species documented, and that number might be as high as 20 million. So you can kind of see where we are with our knowledge of insects. We have a lot to learn, but that's a really nice problem to have, as I say. So thank you, everybody, for taking part. Congratulations, Vanessa, for being the quickest to answer that question about the number of bumblebee species in North America, 46. We will send all the resources out in the follow-up email, including the recording. So that formally brings to a close the proceedings this afternoon, this evening, tonight, whatever time it is where you are based, because I know we're covering a lot of different time zones. I will stop recording, but I'm very happy to stick around for any questions that you may have, because I'm sure we can learn a lot from each other. And I could just talk about this stuff all night, because bees are great and they're so important. They are under threat, as a lot of insect species are, and there's so much tremendous opportunity to learn or co-learn with your learners about these fascinating creatures. So I thank you so much for joining me in this experience and sharing in this experience, even though we're connecting virtually. And I hope we get to meet in person sometime soon, maybe in front of a bergamot being pollinated by a tricolored bumblebee.